Okay, welcome everybody to the latest live streamed edition of the Scholar Gypsies. I'm delighted today to have Barrister and Senior Counsel Una McGurk to chat with me about the hate speech legislation and just some very recent comments by the Minister for Justice. But before I do that, I just want to remind people to click like, share, and subscribe to the Scholar Gypsies. The option should be below you there on YouTube. If you want to support my work, there's links in the description and chat and all that stuff um, to links to buy a coffee. I'm a writer as well, so if we could do that in the West Awake at westawake.substack.com. Okay, so welcome, Una. I'm getting a little bit of
Thank you,
feedback in my
Gerry.
ear. Um, I suppose, Una, I just wanted to start today by asking you a little bit about the recent comments by Minister McEntee on the hate speech legislation. And are you surprised that people are still pushing this so hard, given the March 8th legislation and also the results of that? And a lot of the political class are now against, or seem to be against, the hate speech legislation.
Well, Gerry, I think it's clear that there is a significant pushback now in respect of this legislation, and I think that has occurred especially since the result of the March 8th referenda and the resounding no, and a lot of politicians have suddenly had to reassess their positions on this hate speech, and I think a number of Sinn Féin TDs have now said that they actually will not support it, even though they voted in favour of it in the Dáil. So that shows you that the mood is changing, because at last, after all these years, the politicians are beginning to sit up and listen to the people. So that's a really good thing. But notwithstanding that, the Minister for Justice, the current Minister for Justice, Minister McEntee, was on TV last week on RTE, and it seems clear from the comments that she made that she's still very keen to push and promote this legislation. I don't know. I think that's probably the interview you're referring to. And
Yeah.
essentially, what she said in a nutshell, she said that she was concerned about the fact that we need to be catching up with the rest of Europe, and that we're the only country in Europe that doesn't have any hate crime. Well, my response to that, Gerry, would be, so what? We don't need any hate crime here. There is no mandate for any hate crime. The Irish people haven't looked for this. And in fact, with regard to this legislation started its life off in 2019. And at that time, there were submissions sought from members of the public as to how they viewed the proposals by the government at that time. And over 70% of the people indicated in those proposals that they didn't want this legislation. But like so many other things that are done by this government, they're ignoring the will of the people. This is a growing concern. And this minister has effectively said the same thing. She's only interested in what the rest of Europe is doing, not in the interests of her own people. And there is no mandate from the Irish people for the government to introduce this legislation. So it's really important to say that. So what we have here, and I just want to talk briefly about this before we actually get into the legislation, is really this concept of what I see as the increased federalization of Europe, where Ireland and other countries will be seen as satellite states, reporting back to the mothership in Brussels. And it's arguable that we're in that situation right now, and where we have ministers concerned about how it will be perceived in Brussels and whether or not they're carrying out their mandates or their functions for their European masters, not for the people whom they are supposed to serve here. So on that score, I think what we actually need, and I think what this is leading towards, is really where we should be having a debate on our membership of the European Union. I think it's time that we reassessed where we are and do we really want this? Because you know, you have this growing dissent now because people are concerned that we seem to be losing increasingly our sovereignty. And we've had that famous remark by Micheál Martin when he was Taoiseach, who said that we don't want to have anything to do with this backward looking notion of sovereignty. And a lot of people are questioning as to whether or not this is really what we signed up for in 1973 when we became a member of, you know, what was then, I think, the EEC, and then we voted for all the various treaties in the meantime. So the only issue, of course, with that is that this government are not likely to support such a public debate. And indeed, it's very likely that the next government will not support one either. But I do feel that there is a growing sort of concern there that we need to deal with this issue. And it's interesting that in that context, we have a minister publicly stating on our national broadcaster that we need to be catching up with the rest of Europe. So that tells you how she and the rest of the government feel when it comes to implementing legislation. And on that score, I just want to touch on briefly a piece of EU legislation, which is now effective here, which in a sense does relate to the proposed domestic legislation, which I promise I will talk about in a few moments. But this Digital Services Act, I think you've probably heard of that.
Yeah.
It's currently in place. It's a piece of EU legislation, so it applies all across Europe. And essentially, it's about establishing clear rules for how online platforms can operate. And it's about harmonizing those rules. And it's designed to tackle illegal content online, which interestingly also includes illegal hate speech. So I feel that our government, and in particular this minister, wants to have this domestic legislation in place so it can dovetail with the overarching legislation of the EU, because every European state now has this hate speech legislation and the hate crime legislation. And then, as I said, that dovetails very well with the overarching Digital Services Act. Now, just on that, part of the process is that each country will have an enforcement wing, like a digital services coordinator set up in each country, reporting back effectively to the mothership in Brussels. So we have our Commission na Man here in Dublin, which is in Ireland, which is already up and running. And this Commission na Man has the authority to appoint trusted flaggers, they're called. So for that, read fact checkers for Commission na Man. If you've read 1984, think Ministry of Truth. So we're already here with regard to that. And these trusted flaggers can monitor and take down online content. So the overarching legislation is going to tackle censorship at a different level. In other words, at the platform level, where they can remove content. And then the local domestic legislation targets the individual. So you see how they're covering all their bases with both of these sets of legislation. And as a consequence, what if they succeed in bringing about the domestic legislation? What you will have really is an overarching censorship grid, you know, which covers every facet of what we can do. Now, on the Digital Services Act, which I've just described, violators who are the online platforms, I'm talking about Google and TikTok and Snapchat and YouTube and X, all these big platforms, they face very significant fines of 6% of their annual turnover if they are in breach of any of the rules under this act. And interesting, recently, the commissioner who was responsible for bringing in this act, his name is Commissioner Breton, last year when there were riots in Europe, he stated that in effect, they could shut down platforms like TikTok and Snapchat and effectively shut down the internet. And there was uproar in Europe from all of these human rights, digital human rights activists, and he eventually had to retract his statement because there was great concern that this is what they would do. But it shows you the mentality of these people, and that's why I'm bringing it to your attention. So
Well, no,
the other thing
just
that's
before
relevant.
Una, just before
Sure,
you move on, I just have a quick question for you. So, in effect,
of
are
course.
the legislators trying to get the social media platforms to be the enforcers for them?
Correct. Exactly.
Okay.
And they will be the enforcers, because if they want to avoid paying very hefty fines, what they're going to do is censor material themselves. So you have censorship now will be operating at the platform level, on top of what we
Yeah.
ourselves as, ordinary citizens and individuals will have to deal with when it comes to the domestic legislation. So really it's all about censorship. But of course, it's packaged, with all this virtue signaling language that it's all about tackling illegal content. And there are clauses in it which would relate to the protection of children from human trafficking and all of that. And of course, that's very good. And I don't think anybody would not support that. But that's thrown in for good measure. There's all the other stuff about how effectively platforms will censor themselves to avoid any, you know, um, sort of any breaches of the legislation. So that I think will be a concern going down the line. And there's just one other thing I want to mention with regard to this Digital Services Act, which, as I said, is already in place. In the event of a crisis, which by the way will include, a health crisis or an emergency, and for that you can read pandemic. The mothership in Brussels will instruct the social flaggers, or the trusted flaggers, and the social media platforms to enhance their content, and their algorithms to ensure that only trusted information from trusted sources will be made available to online users. So they would have the power to alter the algorithms and to alter the content of their platform output to ensure that information that might be considered to be detrimental to the narrative or the propaganda that's being proposed. So this is how, in future going down, there is a serious risk that a lot of the freedoms that we currently enjoy now with regard to how we promote and manifest the truth of what's really happening may become curtailed. But it hasn't happened just yet, so we'll have to watch this space. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention and to the attention of those who are listening at this moment in time. So back to what the minister said then. She said that we had to have the hate crime, that we were the only ones in Europe who didn't have hate crime. She also said that we need to come in now into the digital world. So what many people may not realize is that we do have existing legislation which criminalizes hate speech. It's the Prohibition on Incitement to Hatred Act of 1989. Now, that is quite a while ago, and I think if I can remember that far back myself, I don't think we had smartphones, and I don't even think we had the internet. So, the definitions that are in the Act, you could argue, might not be specifically relevant to the digital age, although I would argue that the broadcast term is in itself very broad in the current legislation. But what I would say is that it would be very easy to tweak the existing legislation to bring it into the digital age. But I believe the real reasons why the minister wants to have the new proposed legislation is for very many other reasons, because in the existing legislation, the prosecution have to prove intent. Gerry, are you still there? You've disappeared from my screen. I'm not sure you're still there, Gerry. Are you?
For a second, I'm back. Apologies, people, for that.
Oh, that's no problem. You're back. So what I was just saying about the existing legislation, as you know, this is criminal legislation, which means that anybody who's accused of committing an offence under this legislation has to go through a criminal process. And anybody who is accused of a crime or accused of an offence is innocent until proven guilty. You've heard of this concept before. It's a fundamental concept of our criminal justice system. So the prosecution have to prove intent. So that can be a difficult hurdle for them to overcome. And as a consequence, there are very few convictions under the existing legislation. But in the Department of Justice website, they have indicated that one of the reasons why they want the new legislation is because they need more convictions. So what I would say to anybody who expresses this, why would a government or a minister want to introduce legislation so that they can procure or secure more criminal convictions against their own people? So I think that's a legitimate question to ask. But in the new proposed legislation, the hurdle is not so great for the prosecution to overcome, because now all that's required is that prosecution proves that the individual who's been charged with the offence is reckless as to whether or not the offence is being committed. So recklessness is now the new standard, as well as intent. So it's either intent or recklessness. So that's a lower threshold. It's a lower bar for the prosecution to have to overcome if they want to have a prosecution. So I think these are probably the real reasons why the minister wants to have this legislation. And insofar as digitization is concerned, perhaps the real section in the new proposed legislation that deals with digitization is the famous section 15, which deals with search and seizure, and gives extraordinary powers to the Garda Síochána, which I will be talking about in due course. And that section relates to the powers given to the Garda to seize, if necessary or if required, your phone or your computer. So in that sense, that significant section dealing with digitization is not, of course, contained in the existing legislation. So I believe these are the real reasons why the minister wants the new legislation. So to come now to the legislation, essentially the bill, it's got a very
But just before you move on,
sure,
Una, just before you move on, I just want to have a question for you there. What,
of course,
even as you outlaid it there, and I think what people are starting to see is that at the European level there are different webs of legislation that are kind of linking in together in terms of, you know, in terms of kind of subliminally or silently kind of curtailing people's freedoms. You know, we
yes,
could throw in digital currency into that as well. We could throw into a few other things.
yes,
I suppose people are starting to become more aware of this, you know, of these kind of directives coming in from Europe on hate, you know, on hate speech, as you outlined there, but also on the Digitization Act, also on, you know, digital currencies down the road. Do you see it like that? Do you see
oh
that
yeah,
there's these
absolutely.
different
Like with the
strands?
concept of the CBDCs, you know, if they're authorized by the European Central Bank and we have to implement those programs here, that would be very serious and significant, because effectively it won't even be money; it will be tokenization, and you would be totally controlled. You will have, you know, artificial intelligence telling you that you know, if you go to the butcher's and you want to buy a steak, and it will come up on your phone, oh no, sorry, you bought a steak last week, you know, we'll allow you to spend your tokens in the salad counter down the road, down the aisle. But no, you've had your quota of meat now, so off you go and buy some mealworms or crickets if you want protein, but not. I mean, that's if Klaus Schwab and the WEF have their way. So this is the world, you know, that we're heading towards. Like, it's a potentially dystopian world, and we don't want that. And I think people are beginning to realize that, you know, there are some potentially sinister agendas out there, and we need to push back against them.
Now, I suppose that takes us nicely. So if there's a bit of a delay on my end, it's because I'm getting some feedback in my ear, but I'm assured it's not affecting the stream on YouTube. But I suppose, you know, as we move into the hate legislation or hate speech legislation, Ireland's, if this goes ahead, is going to have what's called a hate crime. And I suppose maybe take us start from that kind of concept and maybe work our way through it.
Well, okay, yes. So as I said, there's two sections to the bill. The hate crime actually aspect is the second. It's part two of what's contained in the bill, and what that involves really is a number of offences. I think there's probably about 12 in all, which are already existing offences, but when they're aggravated by hatred, and if the prosecution succeeds in overcoming the threshold and securing a conviction, the accused person can be convicted of what's known as a hate crime. So the hate crime carries a higher tariff or a higher penalty. And that is what's significant about a hate crime. Also, if convicted of a hate crime, that person would be known as having been convicted of a hate crime. So you can imagine the consequences of that, especially if it's a young person and they want to try and get a visa because they can't get a job in Ireland because of the economic policies and they want to travel abroad. Or if they want to get a job even here in Ireland, if you've been convicted of a hate crime, that's going to be very, very serious, very, very serious thing.
And I suppose, and that is the link. Where that integration act, or the Digitization Act is, it's going to make it a lot easier when you have the ideas of these kind of digital soldiers monitoring social media content, monitoring all sorts of things online, and that element of it is the two of them together are going to work very, coercively against people feeling they're free to speak their mind on these platforms. And
Indeed.
I know there's
Sure. And I'll come to that. I'll go back to part one in a minute. But you've asked me to deal with the hate crimes, so that's in part two of the Act. So the important thing to remember that they're already existing crimes. These crimes are already on the statute books. So, for example, you have in the new proposed legislation, you'll have an amendment to the current Criminal Damage Act. You will have an amendment to various criminal justice public order acts. You will have amendments to the non-fatal offences against the person act, and that really deals with assaults. So you have a baseline offence, but if the prosecution can prove that it was aggravated by hatred, now bear in mind that hatred has not even been defined, and I'll come to that in a moment, and where the prosecution can say that at the time or during or immediately after the commission of the offence, the person demonstrated hatred towards the victim. This will all be used by the prosecution to establish, to the satisfaction of the court, that you have indeed committed a hate crime. So the demonstration test involves words or slurs or gestures accompanying the act. So if somebody, for example, is engaged in an assault and they're very abusive towards the victim and they say dreadful things, which I'm not going to repeat online now, but which could be construed as hatred, that will be used against them. And given the fact that we do live in a digital era where so often now these types of incidents are filmed, people have their mobile phones. So if you are saying things, and you might say terrible things in the heat of the moment, or maybe because you've had too much to drink or whatever, and you might be in a temper. So whatever you say now, and if somebody has a mobile phone nearby, the chances are it's going to be recorded. And so what you say effectively will be used against you and potentially could constitute a demonstration of your hatred towards somebody. So the prosecution could use that against you in a prosecution, for example, for assault. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's what
And
happens. And so, so there's an increase in the penalty. That's basically the situation. Base offences aggravated by hatred, or a demonstration test will be applied to show that you were demonstrating hatred by your slurs or gestures or whatever you said, and you will and it's obligatory, it's mandatory for a judge to apply the increased sentence. But what is interesting about this, and I need to say this in case I forget, and why I'm personally objecting to this whole bill, because I used to work in the area of criminal law. It's totally unnecessary. Judges already have inherent powers right now, without this legislation, to take into account aggravating factors or circumstances surrounding the commission of an offence. They don't need this legislation to do that. So I want to make that point very clear. And I may come back to that in a moment, but if I could, I'll just go back to the part one of the proposed bill, which is the bill that the current Minister for Justice wants to push through. So the relevant sections really, which I think would affect most people, I mean, you have interpretation clauses, etc. Section 7, 7, 9, and 7, 8, 9, and 10. And I will go to section 15 as well. Remind me about that, because that's a really important one. This section 7 is one of the principal offences which will impact people, and especially Irish people. Because it's Irish people, it's the native indigenous Irish people who will be mostly impacted by the effects of this legislation, because the legislation is designed to protect people who are members of minority groups who have what are known as protected characteristics. So there's a list of protected characteristics set out.
now, just one question. I've gone through the list. I've gone through the list of protected characteristics, Una, and what you might say about them in total is anyone could claim to be covered by one or two of them. You know, like it could be religious, it could be race. So it leaves you in a situation that where anyone could make the claim that they're being targeted by hate speech based on how there's like they seem so general. Do you see it that way, or how do you see it? Just on the protected
I would agree with that. Yes, and ultimately what this legislation is doing, it's dividing people. Instead of uniting us, we're being divided. It's the age-old divide and conquer. Put people in different categories, make them suspicious of each other. It's all designed to have a chilling effect on speech. Oh, I better not say that, or I better not have my little boy Johnny play with Muhammad over there, because you know they're a family that would come within these protected characteristics. And oh gosh, if there was ever a row broke out, or our Johnny could get into terrible trouble, or if he beat up Muhammad or whatever, you know, a complaint could be made. We could all be investigated. And so you can see how this would have the effect of polarizing society, dividing people, and it's placing essentially minority groups in a separate category. So the question to ask is, why should people who have these protected characteristics, why should they be treated differently to everybody else? Are we not all equal before the law? And under our own constitution, we are. We're all citizens are held equal before the law. Under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think it's Article 7, everyone is equal before the law. Under the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, Article 20, we're all equal before the law. And generally speaking, people, you come before the courts, everyone's treated equally. Now, we're going to give a category of people more rights than others. So you may ask, why should people with protected characteristics enjoy greater protection than people without them. It's going to create a two-tier system of justice, two-tier system of victims. It makes no sense. And as I said, it's creating disunity and disharmony and confusion in society. And it's already starting to have a chilling effect where people will think one thing, but they'll be afraid to express it for fear it will offend somebody. Somebody will make a complaint, and they or their family members could end up undergoing an investigation. And even if it doesn't result in any kind of a conviction, the process that you have to go through, as anybody out there will know, if they themselves or any members of their family have ever been investigated for a criminal offence, it's horrendous. The stress involved is unbelievable. It can break up families. It can destroy families. This is criminal legislation. So this is very serious. And I don't think that the minister who's bringing it in fully appreciates or realizes the significance of what she's doing and how it could negatively impact so many families. But back to Section 7, which is one of the main offences, right? Which basically says it's the offence of incitement to violence or hatred, where somebody communicates material to the public or a section of the public or behaves in public in a manner that is likely to incite violence or hatred against a person or a group of persons on account of their protected characteristics, and does so with intent. Remember, intent to incite violence, or is reckless, which is a lower threshold of proof.
That's a much lower threshold.
It's much lower, much lower, and dangerously so, if I may say so. And that is what is of concern. And this is the new threshold now in the new legislation, which doesn't exist in the existing one. You may recall I said that at the outset. So that's what we're dealing with. Now, if you're convicted of an offence under this section, I know you wanted me to deal with penalties. On summary conviction, you would be liable to pay a Class A fine, which is €5,000, or 12 months in prison, or a term not exceeding 12 months in prison, or both, or on indictment, a similar fine or imprisonment not exceeding 5 years. So what that means for your listeners is essentially if the DPP, who is responsible for instigating the prosecutions under this act, decides that the circumstances of the offence are minor, the Director of Public Prosecutions will direct that the case be dealt with in the district court before a judge. So that's a summary offence. If the DPP considers that the facts are more serious and warrant it being dealt with in the circuit court, that's when the accused will be dealt with on indictment before a jury. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I was just about to ask you about the difference between summary and
the difference between the
indictment.
two. Yeah, summary offence and on indictment. So the penalties are obviously enhanced for an indictment offence.
And I would just ask or add and maybe ask is, this is going to, this, side issue completely is maybe that this is going to put huge pressure on the court system. Like, summary convictions in a district court that is already out of, is almost chaotic with all the types of different criminal offences that are dealing with already, we'll say. Like, is there the capacity in the legal system to deal with this?
I don't think so.
Even if we said it's good, even if we were to say, and we're not at all, but even if we were to say this piece of legislation was good, we don't have the structure. Like the courts, are the court systems
no, I don't
deal
believe
with
we do. There are
the hate
significant
speech
backlogs.
legislation?
Yeah, there are significant backlogs, I believe, in all the courts. Our courts are not designed to deal with this type of legislation, which also means, of course, that if there's a prosecution for anybody under this legislation, and if there are delays, it means that these people could be waiting for months or years before the case comes to court, before they get an opportunity to clear their name. Can you imagine the stress of that on an individual and or their families? I mean, this is all completely unnecessary. For what? Really, at the end of the day, for what? I mean, that's my view. So I just don't think this is the way to deal with genuine hatred. If people experience genuine hatred, then they need help. They need, psychological help to deal with that. Prosecuting them is really not the answer. It's a very unenlightened way to deal with problems in society. Introducing potentially draconian legislation against people is not the way to make a society change or to bring about change in society. I don't think it's very enlightened. So Section 8 deals with, condemnation or denial or trivialization of genocide. So if somebody tries to deny the existence of the Holocaust, for example, that would constitute an offense under Section 8. And then Section 9 then deals with, and this is actually interesting. Section 9, it relates to the previous section I've just outlined with regard to communicating material that's likely to incite hatred or violence. What is extraordinary about that section is that you can be convicted under Section 7 for inciting hatred or violence, even if you are not successful in actually bringing that about. So even if you failed miserably, the prosecution
is there yeah.
The prosecution
Now, like
can succeed
Section 10,
in a
I'm
conviction
not.
against you.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
But one of the things, and you're probably moving on to it now, Una, is that we also have what I'd classify the concept now of a thought crime in Section 10, and I suppose we might get to the
I'm just about to talk about Section 10 now.
Into that area as well.
Yeah, exactly. Right, okay. So Section 10 then describes an offence which again is likely to affect a lot of people. It's the offence of preparing or possessing material likely to constitute or incite violence or hatred against persons on account of their protected characteristics. So a person shall be guilty of an offence under this section if they prepare or possess material that is likely to incite hatred or violence, and they do so either with intent or they are reckless as to whether or not the violence or hatred is thereby incited. So it's the same standard of proof there. And what's interesting about this particular section relating to what is essentially the possession of material or the preparation of material is that the burden of proof shifts. So you may recall at the outset, I spoke about the general burden of proof in a criminal trial always rests with the prosecution, who have to prove the guilt of the accused person, either to the satisfaction of a court in a summary offence or a jury in an indictable offence beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay, so that's the burden of proof. But with regard to this offence that I've just described, which is the offence of possession or preparation of material, the burden shifts on you as an accused person to prove that in circumstances where it's reasonable to assume that you would have been in possession of it, not for personal use, the burden then shifts where you have to prove that you didn't have it for the purpose of inciting violence or hatred against a person or a group of persons on account of their protected characteristics. So that's very unusual, and a lot of lawyers would object to that because it shifts the burden of proof, which is unusual in a criminal case and in criminal legislation. This is not normal. So this is making it more difficult effectively for people to establish their innocence if in fact they've been charged with an offence under this section. And what is also interesting about this section is the potential for businesses to be criminalized. For example, if you were a printer or a publisher and you were asked to produce flyers or leaflets or posters for an online event or a rally or a meeting of some sort, and you could find yourself being investigated under this section if the content could be construed or deemed to incite violence or hatred against a group of people or a person, even a person or a group of persons, on account of their protected characteristics. And bear in mind, all it requires is for one person or a group of persons with these characteristics to make a complaint about you. And once the complaint has been made to the Garda Síochána, for example, the Gardaí are obliged to investigate the complaint. So whether or not they proceed with it and whether or not it proceeds to a prosecution or a conviction, there is the investigation process, which in itself can be very harrowing for people. So these are the situations and circumstances which the Irish people mainly, although there are other people as well who will be affected by this, obviously, are facing if this legislation is enacted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's great to get it's great to get it to go through it there in detail for people, because I think one of the things is people are not aware of the detail and of just aware of how draconian it is
The
when you go through it
legislation
blind.
is,
The legislations, like
yeah,
one of the um penalties, I suppose we'll get to that point now, maybe is in like section 15 with search warrants. And
yes, and I'm just coming
uh,
to that, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And
so yeah.
this legislation, interestingly, and it was described recently by a barrister who I saw interviewed, he's an international barrister, and Lorcan Price is his name, and he described the legislation as pernicious. And I thought it was a very, very good description for it. It's pernicious, and it's really, it's like a minefield. It's designed to trap you on so many levels. And as I said, it's going to create disharmony, disunity, polarization in society. It's not an enlightened policy, and this isn't really where we want to go. And I think that's why there's such a pushback against it, especially from, very seasoned and enlightened observers and practitioners, like, for example, Senator Michael McDowell, who's a very experienced jurist and very experienced criminal barrister himself. I mean, he can see the potential pitfalls in this, as can many other lawyers as well.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, now on to section 15, which is a section that has caused a great deal of concern to many people who are pushing back against this, not least and including the independent senators, of which Senator McDowell is one, and then you Senator Keoghan, Senator Ronan Mullen. They have been very instrumental in delaying the process, really, in the Seanad, which has been very significant. And I know they would have great concerns about about this section 15 that I'm going to describe to you. So this is the section which deals with extensive powers given to the Garda Síochána with regard to search and seizure. So what can happen is that a member of the Garda Síochána can swear in information on oath before a district judge and obtain a warrant to search premises where they reasonably believe that there is material or information that they require in order to investigate an offence, or where they feel that an offence has been committed or is about to be committed in relation to any of the offences under this Act. So having obtained the search warrant, this member, who, by the way, could be just someone straight out of Templemore, and if somebody makes a complaint to them that somebody has this material in their possession in their house, and that really this member should go there and get this material, investigate whether or not offences under the Act are liable to be committed. This member can go at any time to the premises, the subject matter of the search warrant, either on his own or her own, or accompanied by others. They can go anytime. They don't have to give any warning of their arrival. They could arrive when you're having your family over for dinner, you're having a child's birthday party, you could be having a meeting, you could have your family over for dinner, you could be having a party. They can arrive, and they have extensive powers of search and seizure, and they can take not only your hardware, such as your phone or your computer, but that of anybody else that's in your house.
This is the
Which,
now,
mm,
yeah. This is we're now getting into an area where people are not aware of just
yeah,
exactly what could happen. Like you could have a a birthday party. There could be 30 people in your house, and the search warrant actually
exactly.
covers all 30 people in your house.
Correct. And the guard in question has the authority to examine the person as well as the content of their computer or their phone. They can take any material that they deem necessary for the purpose of the investigation. They can ask you for your password. For example, if you refuse to give your password to either your computer or your phone and the guard in question wants it, you have committed an offence and you will automatically be found guilty of an offence where you will be subject to a Class A fine, which is €5,000, and or a term of imprisonment not exceeding 12 months. So if you refuse to give your password for your phone or your computer when requested to do so by a member of An Garda Síochána who comes to your house, could be a dawn raid, and they're looking for this information, that is the fine, that is the penalty that you will suffer. In addition to that, if you obstruct the Gardaí or even attempt to obstruct them in their powers of search and seizure under this section, you will likewise be guilty of that offence. If you even refuse to give your name and address when asked by a member of the Garda Síochána, you will be guilty of this offence, and you could suffer a penalty of 12 months imprisonment or a Class A fine of €5,000.
That's like that's amazing. Like it's just amazing to me that
It is amazing.
that there isn't more outrage on that publicly by our political class and our media class. But I suppose it brings up a question, and it's a slight diversion to what you're talking about there. But recently, I interviewed a Fianna Fáil politician whose house was raided, whose phones were taken, and or his phone was taken, but all of the phones of the people in the house were investigated on his in his home. So what I would say is the existing powers that are in place are 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 they not enough for the Garda Síochána and the Minister for Justice?
Indeed, and that's a very legitimate question. It seems that they already have those powers as they exercised them recently in the case of that politician. And that was clearly sending a message to others who
Hmm.
were not prepared to agree with what the powers that be want them to agree with. And yes, why do they need even more powers under this legislation? Absolutely. But these are very draconian powers. And the problem is they are open to being abused.
Used, yeah.
You know, of course, there are Gardaí out there who would exercise their discretion and maybe not exercise those powers or not utilize them, but you cannot be sure of that in all circumstances and all situations. And it's really not healthy for a nation that you have these very serious powers, available to the Gardaí, which could be abused.
Hmm.
I
And
wouldn't support it at all.
yeah. Sorry, I interrupted your train of thought there. I don't know if
No.
you were going to continue on there.
No, not really. Just other than to say that this is indeed very draconian, and it was just in response to your concern that you wondered why more members of the media and or politicians, you know, didn't object to this, what I suspect really is that they're unaware of it. And I think that if more politicians had maybe read the act or were realized that these powers were being given to the Garda Síochána under this section, that they would have objected to the bill or they might have proposed more amendments. So I suspect that's the reason why. But I think maybe now they're coming to realize that these powers do exist. And again, it's not a healthy situation for anybody to be in. I mean, you could be visiting a friend, you know, and there's a raid, and the Garda Síochána come to the house and they're there ostensibly to obtain information, documentation, passwords, or seize the hardware of your friend. But if they ask you, and who are you, and you know, what's your name and address, and you say, well, it's none of your business, and I'm not going to tell you, which would, in a sense, be an understandable response in the circumstances, straight away, you're guilty of an offence under the section, and you're liable to a Class A fine of €5,000 and or term of imprisonment of 12 months. And of course, what happens with regard to the seizure of hardware like phones or computers, this could be devastating and detrimental to people who rely on this hardware, maybe for their living. If you were a writer or a broadcaster and your phone was taken and your computer was taken, you wouldn't be able to continue to earn your living. And as I said earlier, investigations can take a long time, and it can take a long time for cases to come before the courts. And it can take a long time, and I know this myself from having been in practice before, evidence that's taken legitimately by the Gardaí in the course of an investigation to be returned. So you can see the consequences. The potential consequences of this are enormous, and I don't think anybody has really thought this through.
Absolutely not. And when you think of all the, aside from what they may be looking for on your phone in terms of the incitement to hatred, the amount of confidential information that is on people's phones that would be separate
Yes,
to, you know, whatever offense they're trying to either pursue or jimmy up
absolutely.
or whatever, is like from a
Yeah,
you know, you
of course.
again,
I mean,
it puts
our
people in
phones
a
are
lot
our
of,
lifelines now, and
well,
we need them.
unfortunately, yes, yeah, that is
Mm,
true. I suppose when I want to bring you to a point, I suppose this is kind of off topic a little bit, but you know, a lot of people won't be aware. But I just wanted to give people a bit of background. Is like your career. You're a senior counsel since 2004.
yes,
You were the former chairperson of the Irish Red Cross, the youngest in the world at the time, I
correct.
believe. You've also been on the Peace and Reconciliation Forum for Northern Ireland going back to the 90s, precursor to the Good Friday Agreement. You have a huge career in the legal arena, and yes, you found yourself in 2020 effectively cancelled. And I know you don't like talking too much about it, but I thought maybe uh, uh, to get a flavor of what that felt like for you to go through at the time, and how was it like? What was the effect? Have you been able to deal with it? You know, etc.
Well, it was in many respects a horrific experience, and I certainly I wouldn't wish it on anybody really. And it came as a complete shock and surprise to me because I was asked to speak at a rally in Dublin in August of 2020, and this was, um, you know, a rally or an assembly organised to object to government restrictions because it was considered by many, including myself, that there was significant overreach by the government with regard to the legislation and the manner in which they were conducting themselves during COVID. So I was asked to speak on this issue, and it was my day off, and I was happy to do it at the time, and I said yes, I will do it. I was asked to speak on the mandatory wearing of masks. And because I have a very eclectic background, you know, I've studied geopolitics in Switzerland. You know, I am a qualified holistic dietitian, transformational life coach. I have extensive qualifications in areas other than law. And I have been doing research for years and years and years into a lot of different areas, and I've, you know, been engaged in medical negligence cases, and I've sat on a number of high-powered quasi-judicial tribunals. So I had extensive experience in a lot of areas that would have been very relevant to what was happening during COVID and would have informed my views on that. And I feel that, I mean, just like everybody else, I was entitled to have a view, but I had done the research. So I spoke against the mandatory wearing of masks, which I was deeply concerned about because I knew they were coming down the road for children. And, you know, whilst I had no problem with people wearing masks, and I had friends who wore masks because it made them feel safe. And I totally understand that. And that was of course, something that they're entitled to do, but it was the mandatory wearing of masks that I had a major concern with because of all the potential consequences, you know, restricting breathing, restricting oxygen intake, increasing the carbon dioxide levels of the body, which would lead to all sorts of problems, which I highlighted. And many very, very renowned doctors and scientists had spoken out very, very strongly about the use of masks. I was also aware that the government were going to promote them for school children, and that Professor Luke O'Neill was intending to promote them for school children, which was a source of serious concern to me. And it's very interesting that the Cochrane study has proven that, in fact, I was correct, and that there is evidence to suggest that children's cognitive abilities were adversely impacted as a result of them having to wear masks during that time. But I spoke about that issue. I also spoke about another important issue, which I felt was used as the foundation for the lockdown, which namely was the flawed, fraudulent PCR test. And I was aware that the man who had invented that test, a man called Kary Mullis, he actually got the Nobel Prize for inventing the PCR test. He had stated specifically that this test was not to be used to test for an infection. Now, mysteriously, he died just 2 to 3 months before COVID broke out. But I was conscious that our government, and as indeed all other governments, because they were all in lockstep all over the world, as was designed to be the case, were using this flawed process to lock down the country, to create cases based on alleged COVID in order to lock the country down. Now, what we do know about the test, that insofar as you would even consider using it, the CDC in the States had indicated that it should never be used with magnification cycles above 25. But in Ireland, they were using magnification cycles of 45, which meant that the vast majority of test results would have been false or flawed. So therefore, that most of the positive results would have been false positive. So our government were locking down a nation based on a flawed, fraudulent process called the PCR test. Now, I didn't go into that detail at the rally, but I spoke about it because I felt there should be public debate about these issues, and that the Irish people, not just the Irish people, anybody who was on Irish soil, that included asylum seekers and immigrants and anybody who was in the country, because everybody was being affected by these draconian regulations, that we should know about these things. And I wanted to stimulate a debate on it. I didn't have any other forum in which to do that. So essentially, following that, two government ministers on the following morning. I don't know, do we have time to this? Can we
Yeah,
go
yeah,
over
absolutely. No, no, no.
over
We absolutely.
over the time?
No, no. I'm
Um,
very interested in this. Yeah.
oh, thank you. So I didn't speak for very long because I was actually asked to only speak for 5 minutes. So I curtailed the speech to make it just a short speech. And I was really shocked the next day when I discovered that, you know, there was serious concern raised about my attendance at this rally. And I discovered subsequently that Hazel Chu, who was the Lord Mayoress of Dublin, had tweeted about me the night before, effectively condemning my presence at the rally. This was taken up by Minister Rodrigo Gorman the following morning, Sunday morning, and he started tweeting about me and Helen McEntee, the Minister for Justice. So they were tweeting amongst each other publicly about this barrister who had spoken out at this rally. Now, what's very interesting about the approach that all of them took was that nobody made any reference to a single word that I had spoken about. And it was quite clear to me subsequently that the reason for that was because I was over the target and they did not want any discussion about those issues or topics. So they had to shut me down. So they had to find an angle which they felt they could utilize, which would work against me. So I was at that time a member of a tribunal known as the International Protection Appeals Tribunal, which is the tribunal that deals with appeals by asylum seekers looking for international protection. It's
which is quite
otherwise known
topical now.
as it is now. Yeah, it was otherwise known as IPAT, but at the time, nobody knew about that tribunal. Nobody had heard about it unless you were actually actively involved in the system. You wouldn't have known about that. And anybody who had heard me speak at that rally wouldn't have cared less what I did or what tribunal I was on or what my
There was
background.
only one story in town in 2020, and that was COVID.
Yes,
There was no one
it was
talking about
COVID.
it. Yeah.
Exactly. Immigration
Mm.
wasn't even an issue at all for anybody. But I think it's important to state that I never dealt with immigration matters. I have nothing to do with immigration. That's dealt with by the alien section of the Department of Justice. It translates into government policy. I have had and still have nothing to do with immigration. What I was dealing with at all times in my professional capacity was simply international protection um, applicants who were asylum seekers looking for international protection. It's a completely different area. But the people who jumped on the bandwagon afterwards deliberately, I feel, conflated the two, which was very confusing for the members of the public, I'm sure, who were looking on. But essentially, what concerned me about the two ministers who started publicly tweeting about me was I thought this was so unseemly and undignified for two senior government ministers to be publicly tweeting about a senior counsel who was exercising her right to freedom of expression and speaking out at an event on a Saturday afternoon in her own spare time. They felt that they needed to do it publicly. I take the view that the minister had no right. She called for a public, an urgent inquiry into my behaviour, giving the impression that I had done something terribly wrong. So this looked very bad. And obviously, all these tweets and all the newspaper articles which resulted and which came on foot of the inspirational tweets by the two ministers are still there online. So if you Google me, you'll come across all this nefarious information. So it really sent a message that it's open season for Una McGurk now. You can really write anything you want about this lady. So
Well, I can I'll frame it this differently. I'll frame it to you this way: is that I can understand 100% why they needed to shut you down quickly, because I mean, in the sense of that, here we have a senior counsel, a person of huge standing. They've got little or no, they've sketchy or little or no science backing up these lockdowns. The
yes,
public don't know it wouldn't have taken much to back you up. We'll say a few other voices, especially in 2020. And they panicked, and like, not panicked, but like they were always going to come down hard because they needed to I'm trying to find a better way to say this, but they needed to shut you down quick, in
yes.
case what you were saying started to make traction in the general population. Would you see it a
That's
bit like that?
absolutely That's absolutely correct. So they were prepared. So as a consequence, I effectively lost my career, and it's a long, and I got cancelled. And there were all these articles written about me in mainstream media. They fell somewhat short of defaming me, but I was called a conspiracy theorist because I wrote about 5G or did a video on 5G. 5G is very real. It's a serious concern for the health and welfare of everyone on the planet, and also this nation. There's nothing conspiratorial about the dangers of 5G, but I was called a conspiracy theorist because I had done a video on 5G. So the content of the articles was extremely disrespectful. And I believe that the actions of the two ministers was also very disrespectful to me as a senior counsel, because I was just like anybody else. I was entitled to have that opinion, and I didn't take those opinions out of fresh air. I didn't make them up. I had done a significant amount of research to back up my opinions. But the reason why I'm even talking about this is that I don't want this to be about me at all.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
this could have been anybody, Gerry. Any person in Ireland, any citizen could have suffered a similar fate who spoke out. So it was designed to have a chilling effect, I believe, also on my colleagues. Look what happened to this barrister. In case anybody else thinks that they can step out of line, uh, you be very careful, because this is what we can do. And ultimately, the two ministers, or certainly one minister, definitively took action, in which she decided she wasn't going to renew my contract. That was the Minister for Justice in the following um, February. Now, that is the prerogative of the minister, and I accept that she has those powers. And she gave a number of reasons as to why she wasn't going to do that. One of them I can't really discuss because it's potentially sub judice, because it's
Absolutely.
the subject
Then,
matter of proceedings I'm involved in. But one of them is interesting and it's instructive, and I will talk about it because, again, it shows an attitude which is very relevant to the discussion we've just had about the proposed legislation. Because if this government could do what they did to me without this legislation,
that's what I
what
was going to
will
start.
they do if this legislation is enacted to
Mhm.
anybody who disagrees with their opinions or any dissenters whatsoever? So this is why it's important. But if I just may get the letter of the minister during that period of time when I was effectively suspended, and the report on me was being bandied around the place and was languishing in the office of the Attorney General, I attended an online conference where I expressed my views about the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab, and I expressed concern about them and what they had intended to do and their transhumanist agenda, which was very worrying, especially in the context of the proposed hate speech legislation coming down the road of the government. And I made some comment that, we're looking here at potentially at, as we know, predictive programming is very real, a potential minority report situation where the thought police, will arrive at your doorstep if people are subject to microchipping, which they are at the moment,
Which, yeah, well,
ostensibly.
we've already seen it with Musk's
Yes,
company
it's
successfully
there
doing it. So,
ostensibly to monitor your health, but it also monitors your blood pressure. It also gives information about heightened emotional states, which could in the future be abused and misused against you to determine that you're in a heightened emotional state when speaking to your neighbor, and therefore you might be at risk of causing them harm. So that was the essential um, you know, the essential theme of that particular movie. So, yes, it might. Hopefully, it won't happen. But it was a potential dystopian outlook that we need to be very careful of, and we need to be very mindful of, because, as you say, these factors are now in place. So everything that's being done to bring this about, it's always done step by step by step. So little by little, your freedoms are being encroached upon. Little by little, there's more and more increasing censorship until eventually, you know, you're right in the grid and you've no means of escape. But back to what the minister said. In any event, I spoke about these types of events. I didn't realize that I was being monitored or that the information about what I was saying was going to be reported back to the minister, but it was. And they quoted some of what I said, and the comment made by her private secretary who was writing on her behalf was as follows, and I'm going to quote this. Furthermore, the minister is concerned that your comments, as quoted above in relation to hate speech legislation, is contrary to government policy in an area for which she herself is responsible. So there I was expressing a view at a time and in circumstances where I was under the impression, again, that I had the right to freedom of expression as espoused in my constitution. But
Again, just before you just, I'm sorry, because
yes,
just what you read out there, it's curious she didn't say what you were saying was wrong. She said it was contrary to government policy, which
yes.
is
And
an interesting way to
it is an
phrase that.
interesting thing to say. And given the fact that I and everyone else who was sitting on the tribunal at that time and still, even to this day, would be under the illusion that they are independent in the performance of their functions, because it's an essential criterion in order to be appointed onto a committee like that, is that, you know, whatever your views are about certain things, that you are independent in the performance of your functions, which means that you don't um, subscribe, you don't have to subscribe to government policy, or you don't have to implement government policy. Yes, you have to implement legislation that exists, of course, that's completely different, but you're under no obligation to really, you should be under no obligation to agree
You're
with
not
hate
a,
speech legislation.
yeah, but you're not on an independent committee or tribunal to promote government policy.
Correct.
Do you know what? No matter whether you're a barrister, whatever the forum might be, it's on a specific focus, and the reason you're on it is for your independence. The reason you're on it is for your separation from the government, surely.
Yes, yes, indeed. And you know, yes, absolutely. Just, but it was quite an extraordinary thing to have been said on behalf of the minister. So that basically, you know, you don't agree with my legislation, so there's no room for you on my tribunal. So for all those barristers out there who think that they are independent, and they can be independent and have their own views about things and still retain their positions, they might just be in trouble with this government if the word got out that, well, actually, maybe they don't agree with government policy, or maybe they're against the hate speech legislation.
Yeah.
So it
One.
shows an attitude which I think is just, it's not very healthy.
No.
And, you know, and it is a concern for me. And then with regard to the Green Party, because Minister Rodrigo Gorman, as you know, is a Green Party minister, and he was one of the two ministers tweeting about me publicly. Again, why did they have to do it publicly? If anybody had a concern about what I was doing, they could have contacted me privately or contacted IPAT, but
Well, they
no,
had
this
to
had to be done publicly
quick, but it had to be done publicly. Like, I'm just
and
going through
quickly,
this cycle and quickly, and then
quickly.
like that's it. Like, they were never going to give you due process. Like, do you know what I mean? It
No,
was like,
no, no, definitely not. I was going to be shut down. So then there was a development then on behalf of the Green Party when the following day, literally within 24 hours of Minister O'Gorman tweeting about me and expressing concern and saying he was keeping in touch with the Minister for Justice in relation to this issue, the Meath East Green Party chairperson is a man called Adrian Smith, and I don't know him and I don't know anything about him. He published a letter on Twitter, on their Twitter account, as Twitter as it was then, because we're talking about August of 2020. And it was a letter, very serious letter, which called for the Minister for Justice to terminate my membership of IPAT with immediate effect, effectively. So, but what was interesting about this is that it was clearly drafted. This letter was clearly drafted by a lawyer or someone with significant legal experience. And we all know that solicitors' offices don't open on Sunday. Can't get a barrister to do anything for you unless they're your best friend. So I don't know who crafted or drafted this letter, but whoever did so did it with significant knowledge of the operation of the International Protection Act of 2015, also the Code of Conduct. So whoever drafted this or crafted this was in the know. Now, I don't know of Adrian Smith as a solicitor. I can't find any reference to him or what he does for a living. There's no available information about him online that I can find. All I know is that he's a chairperson of the Meath East Greens. I don't think he's a solicitor. Maybe he is. Maybe he drafted this letter himself. I don't know. But what I think it would be reasonable to assume that whoever crafted or drafted the letter, that the Minister for Integration, Roderick O'Gorman, would have been well aware of this letter. I don't think this letter would have been published or
Well, they wouldn't
submitted
have
to
gone on a
Twitter
solar
without his
run
knowing
without.
about
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Hmm?
It is unlikely they went on a solar, like it's unlikely the Meath East or
Yeah,
whatever it was,
yeah,
Green Party went on a solar run without their minister's opinion on the matter. Like, you know, like I
indeed.
can't.
I mean, he's a senior minister in the party. And the interesting thing about the constituency where the letter was published is that it's the constituency of the Minister for Justice.
Mm-hmm. It's a
So you
very
had the two
interesting
ministers
constituency that.
tweeting publicly on a Sunday morning, and then within 24 hours, this letter appears. And the letter is still on the website, by the way. Anybody can read it, and it's very interesting because here's what it accuses me of: that I was speaking at a public rally organised by far-right groups. Not true. Which was advertised by and attended by a host of extremist groups on the far right. Not true. With a history of overtly racist rhetoric. Not true. And to have called for an end to immigration into Ireland in all forms. Not true. Is a choice that creates a reasonable apprehension of bias. So
Well, I
that's
just
just an
comment on
example
that.
of the kind of rhetoric that was put out there about me. Yeah.
That's very interesting because that to me has NGO fingerprints on it, because the term far right in 2020 was not in common usage in Ireland.
Yeah.
It became common towards maybe the end of 21, 22, and now we're all far right now. But back in 2020, that terminology, again, a bit like the asylum stuff, it was going on, but even like I wasn't, put it like this, I thought it was waking up to things in 2020, but I wasn't really aware of the asylum issues. Even the far right terminology was an American thing. It was certainly a big deal in the US with the presidential election of 2020. But I suppose the question I want to ask you, maybe following on from that train of thought, and this is just your own personal opinion given what you've been through, do you think those two ministers in particular had an inkling of what was coming down the train on immigration and asylum seekers at that point? Or do you think the institutions of the state knew what was coming on, the asylum seeking? We all know what the asylum seeker issues are and refugee stuff is now, but do you think it was
Yes.
even back then kind of in plot?
I do. I do. I think they knew exactly what was coming down the line. I can't prove it, but I just think what they were doing and their reactions would certainly indicate that. And it's very interesting what you say about the concept of far right, because that was, I thought, what's that? What does that mean? I'm far right. Who are these far right people? Who are they? I was really shocked. Wait a minute. I was speaking about masks and PCR tests. I was there on behalf of Health Freedom Ireland. I was with two other speakers. Dolores Cahill, who was there in her capacity as a scientist, and Marcus de Bruin, who was there as a GP. They wanted a doctor, a scientist, and a lawyer to speak about those issues. But the Yellow Vest movement, the rally was held in association with the Yellow Vest movement. So there were other speakers speaking about a variety of issues, but they were all essentially concerned with government restrictions in relation to the lockdown process, etc., etc. Now, Irish flags, there were people carrying Irish flags, which seems to be now, something the government really doesn't like, you flashing the tricolour anywhere. This doesn't fit well or sit well with this, oh, we don't want to have anything to do with this backward-looking idea of sovereignty, so put away your tricolour flags now and let's just display the EU flag. So when people with that mindset see people who have tricolours, I think it makes them very nervous.
Well, I think you were at that rally was probably the most, if we look back on it now, that was a very significant rally because it was the only rally we actually, I say we, but it was the only rally that got the numbers on the street. So, like, if you look back at it, it was you really walked into the middle of, you did like you'd if you were doing that today, you'd probably ask a few questions about, given what we know about the state apparatus and how that rally probably had some infiltration from, NGO type protest groups who were kind of probably masquerading in the crowd, so that they had that immigration group that they could sling the mud at you from the sidelines, or whoever it might have been that said the controversial thing.
Yes, I think that's probably very likely. But I mean, what happened took me completely by surprise. As I said, because I was just speaking about unrelated matters. I would never have spoken about immigration matters. And like, I didn't know, I subsequently discovered that some of the people were members of the Irish Freedom Party, but I didn't know any of them at the time. And they weren't there speaking in their capacity as members of the Irish Freedom Party. And that's very significant. I mean, I had political affiliations as well, which nobody bothered to,
Ask
ask any questions about. But I wasn't there in my capacity as someone who was formerly associated with Fianna Fáil, actually, would you believe? That was irrelevant. So suddenly, these people who were connected with the Irish Freedom Party suddenly became very relevant, what their political affiliations were. So that was information that was really being used against me to paint a picture that really was biased, and it wasn't accurate, because, as I said, the people who were there who happened to have affiliations with that party were not speaking on behalf of the party or about those matters. They were speaking about other matters. And as far as I know, I don't know what the situation is now, but at that time, the Irish Freedom Party just believed in controlled immigration, similar to the Australian points system. So, to see that the remarks that are being made here by the Meath East people who put this tweet up, it simply just doesn't make sense. But it seems like they didn't want any obstacle in their way, or any potential obstacle in their way for what they felt was coming down the line. So reading this information, it would tend to support your theory that this, certainly Minister O'Gorman, knew what was coming down the tracks. That's all I'll say. And interestingly enough, with regard to that rally as well, which I think it's important to state, the Irish Times, which at the time I considered to be the paper of record, reported, I think, that there was either 400 or 500 people at the rally, as did RTE. I can tell you there was a minimum of probably 7,500 people at that rally. There was an extraordinary number of people. So, there you have your disinformation already. And they also reported that there were scuffles at the rally, and no scuffles took place either at the rally or within the cordon of the rally. But there were scuffles that took place outside the cordon, where apparently people became aware that Antifa groups were intending to come and disrupt the rally, but they were apprehended before they got to the rally. So there were no scuffles or anything of that nature. It was an extraordinarily peaceful rally. I mean, there was a beautiful Italian singer who sang Nessun Dorma. There was a 1-minute candlelit vigil for all the people who had died alone in the care homes. It was a very dignified event on so many levels. And that's why it was just such a shock for me to experience the reaction, both of the two government ministers and indeed the media subsequently, because it was completely at odds with the reality of the situation. And as I
Well,
said, it was completely misreported.
we've seen so many more examples of that in the intervening years as well,
Yes,
on different
yes.
subjects. One last question, Una, I want to get you. I want to ask this to you, and we're going an hour and 20 there. Do you see what's going on, in the general scheme of things in Ireland as a kind of like, I'm coming more and more to the conclusion that there is a spiritual element to this, that as much as we're fighting politicians, legislation, outside influences, like the WEF or the UN or the EU, that we're in a sense in a fight to protect or preserve the soul or spirit of the nation. Do you feel
Yes,
do you
I
feel
do
in that,
feel
in
that
those
very
terms?
strongly. I think really there's a spiritual battle going on, um, all over the world, and it really manifested in the whole COVID pandemic situation, and the draconian measures that were taken by all governments. I feel there was a reason for that. It was designed to prepare us for what was coming down the line, which is not very pretty. And certainly we can talk about that in due course. But what is really wonderful for me to see is that, especially in the last few months, and I think this was really made manifest with the recent referenda result, is that the spirit and the soul of the nation has risen again.
Yes,
Actually, it's almost
I'm on the same path with you, because I think that
brings
result.
me to tears because I had wondered where it had gone, and it's back again. And that soul, that fighting Irish spirit, sort of, I feel that the goddess Aru has arisen again and is influencing the Irish, and they're suddenly standing up and saying, enough is enough. They want their politicians and their government to represent their interests. They're no longer satisfied to have a government that's clearly captured by external influences. We're talking about Leo Varadkar and others who make their trips on a regular basis to get their instructions from the WEF. I mean, they must really think we're stupid if we can't see what's going on. I mean, the information is out there about the WEF. It's not a conspiracy theory. These are facts that many Irish people need to become aware of, but they won't get that information on the national broadcaster, and they won't get that information from the fourth estate, who no longer are holding our public representatives to account. I mean, there was a time when I grew up, Gerry, that the fourth estate, namely the media, did hold politicians to account. That's no longer the case. They are now a propaganda arm of the government. And that's very sad and very unfortunate. But thankfully, a lot of people are wakening up to that fact. So I feel that the soul and spirit of Ireland has definitely awoken. So long may it continue, so that we get back our power to hold the current power interests in the country, which are represented by the government. We hold them to account. And the way we do that is by speaking truth to power. And if everybody does that, it will make a huge difference, because ultimately we will change the zeitgeist. And that's what it's all about. And as I said, that process started just before the referenda, the recent referenda. The result was phenomenal. And I think it has given a lot of impetus and energy to the spirit and soul of the Irish people at the moment. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. I'm delighted to see it.
Mm-hmm. Look, thanks for that, Una. Look, Una, thanks a million. I'm going to wrap it up there, but we'll speak again, as they say, hopefully. I just want to apologize to anyone that's watching. There was a couple of problems with my internet connection there, so there might have been a break early on in the chat with Una there, but I think it's more or less okay, and I can see there's plenty of comments here in support of you, Una. Last but not least, if you've made it to the end and you want to support the channel, subscribe or share the video, or there's an option in the chat and in the pinned comments to the Buy Me a Coffee link to my website and stuff like that. So we'll leave it at that, Una, and
Thank
we'll
you.
say goodbye.
And thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you very much, Gerry, for having me. And also I just want to say thank you in advance to all those wonderful people. If you said nice comments about me, I just want to thank you for those. I'm very appreciative of them.
Okay, thanks, Una.
Yeah,
And
thank
I'll
you
just
very
end
much,
it.
Gerry. Have a good evening. God bless. Thank you. Bye-bye.